Hello and good afternoon friends, welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, from today onwards we are starting a new series and this series is on basic sociology. In this session today we would be discussing on Sociology of India. We would be carrying two lectures on Sociology of India. This is the first lecture. In the first half we would be discussing on approaches to study of India, whereas in the second half we would be discussing on Indian sociological approaches. And for this discussion we have once again with us in our studios Dr. Archana Prasad. Dr. Archana Prasad is Assistant Professor in Department of Sociology, Kamla Nehru College, University of Delhi. So let's welcome our guest, Dr. Archana Prasad, and let's try to have deep insight into the topic. Hello ma'am, welcome to the EduSet lecture.
Hello Gitika, thank you. Welcome back to the series lecture in sociology. This is a series of lecture and I'm trying to understand sociology, that is basic sociology. Sociology as a discipline is very vast and complex, and the series of lecture tries to capture the integral parts of sociology. And today's lecture, I begin with talking on Sociology of India. Sociology of India is a very interesting topic because it is the way in which it has emerged, developed, and yet trying to grapple with the crisis in the discipline. As to begin with the lecture, I would try to point out that I am going to be very brief. Each of these topics can in itself form a lectures, but then you cannot go on having it. So we are going to just touch on the integral or most important part of the Sociology of India. In today's lecture, it consists of two parts. Part one is basically trying to understand approaches to the study of sociology, specifically focusing on Indian society. And in the second part, I'll be trying to look into the Indian sociological perspective. That is to specifically bring in the contribution of a large number of Indian sociologists to the discipline. And if we look into the way in which the discipline has emerged, we realize that the emergence is rooted in the colonial background. It was both the colonial society and contribution by Western scholars, by British scholars, that led finally to the emergence of the discipline of sociology. So when we try to look into the objective of today's lecture, the first objective is to examine the three main approaches to the study of Indian society. And these three main approaches are the colonial approach, the nationalist approach, and the subaltern approach. Then we'll try to understand the contribution of each of these approaches to the development of sociology of India. And we try to compare and contrast what is the contribution of each of these approaches to the growth of the discipline. Then we try to understand the specifically Indian contribution to the discipline. That is, the large number of sociologists like Gurre, M.N. Srinivas, A.R. Desai, and n number of other sociologists have contributed immensely to the development of this discipline. And I will briefly touch on the major areas and the major work that these sociologists have contributed to the development of sociology in India. And therefore, we also try to understand that like any other discipline, it has certain drawbacks, and it is large number of scholars like Satish Deshpande, Veena Das have raised the consciousness that there is a certain kind of crisis in the discipline of sociology, and we need to come out of that crisis. And therefore, I will also reflect very briefly on the crisis in Indian sociology. To begin with, let us try to understand that there are three different ways of understanding. One is sociology in India, that is to concern itself with the approaches to the study of Indian society. This would deal with the large number of researches which are done on Indian society, for example, to understand caste, kinship, village studies, gender, etc. Then we have sociology in India, that is how is the discipline developed, that is what are the sociologists or the Indians contributing to research and teaching in the Indian society. And then we have sociology for India, that is to have a discipline which specifically focuses on the Indian society. That is, it has its own theories, it has its own concepts which are able to describe Indian society specifically. And therefore, we try to see that there is a kind of an evolution from sociology of India to sociology in India and then to sociology for India. What I mean to say is that when the discipline emerged, it was like India was kind of an object of study for the foreigners. They were trying to understand Indian society from an outside perspective. After post-independent period, we see a large number of sociologists trying to do integrated research on Indian society. So this was sociology in India. And then when we talk about sociology for India, is trying to evolve or try to develop a discipline which is specifically on the Indian society. And here what is the imperative is that the discipline itself emerged due to the impact of Western process and because of the large number of notions, dichotomies that were taken from Western sociology and was used to understand Indian society. Now, there is a need to question that how appropriate are these concepts which are relevant to understand Western society also applicable to the Indian society, or do we need to have a different kind of a concept, different kind of a process which could capture the reality of Indian society more than the Western concept, and therefore the phrase sociology for India. If you look into the lecture, it's a kind of a flow from sociology in India to sociology of India to sociology for India. When I talk about sociology of India, I'm trying to focus on the study of Indian society by the Western scholars, basically, and it is known as the colonial approach, because it began, the seed of sociology of India was in the colonial period. So, as I've already said, that India was an object of study. And what were the features of Indian society which was highlighted when you try to understand India as an object of study? First is to understand the changes due to external force. Like this is interesting because the discipline of sociology itself has emerged during an industrial revolution, and there was a large amount of change, shift from a simple society to a complex society. So the discipline was emerging at a time when these changes were taking place in society, and so the focus was to capture the changes due to the forces of westernization, industrialization and other economic and non-economic changes. Then how do the indigenous population responded to this change? And therefore, we see during the colonial period a large number of contribution or theories were trying to understand how there was a change in the village, how there was a change from endogamy to exogamy, from class to class. So they were trying to understand that India as a society was subject to change due to the forces of external processes. And then the third outcome feature was to emerge at a holistic study of society, which was trying to take into account the political, economic and cultural life. So these three were not kind of unrelated to each other, but the sociologists were trying to bring about an integrated study of the society. Now, India was not the only society which was under colonial rule. There were a large number of other society, but the study of India was different from the other society during the colonial period because of large number of factors. One was that it had a longer history of colonial rule than the other society, and therefore even before the Britishers had arrived, there were depictions of Indian society as travelers, as people, Western people who had come and documented the practices of Indian society. The second factor is existence of multiple forms of economic and political system in the society. As we are aware that India is a kind of a heterogeneous society, where you find multiple kind of economy, multiple kinds of political system, and therefore to study Indian society would require a different approach than the other societies. Then the other third important factor was that there was the existence of a body of knowledge on Indian society even prior to the arrival of the Britishers. So you had Sanskritic scholars, you have large amount of literature in the form of Shastra and Vedas, and large number of documents and texts written by kings and scholars. So there was no absence of material on Indian society. So it was not difficult to actually come out and translate these material into English language and come to the understanding that they have studied Indian society. Now, when we try to understand the three approaches, the first important approach is the colonial discourse. And as I have already said, the colonial discourse is the study of India as an object of study by the colonial rulers, that is the Britishers. And a huge body of literature was created during this period on the Indian society, on caste system, on village, and on family life. The ideas and explanation and also the interpretation by the Western scholars of the Indian social system is actually the base of the development of the sociology of India. And then in the colonial discourse, if we look into it, B.S. Cohn has pointed out to three important approaches that were relevant for understanding India. And these were the Orientalist, the missionary, and the administrators. Now, each of these traditions had its own role. That is, the people who were contributing to these three perspectives had a different role in the colonial period, and the study that they came out with was a reflection of their role and the objective or the purpose for which they were trying to do the study. And that is to say that the Orientalist, which is described as the study of Indian society from the Western perspective, were trying to do a kind of a comparative study of India versus the Western society. The missionaries, as the name suggests, were people from the British society who were given the task of conversion. That is, there were missionaries in India who had a religious objective of converting Hindus into Christianity, and the administrators were British officials who were given the task to administer the society. So the Orientalist, if we look into the contribution that the three traditions have done to the study of society, is that because the Orientalists were trying to compare Western society and Indian society, they came up with a large number of dichotomies, and they came up with a kind of a Western measure to understand Indian society. And they started with the critique of Indian society. That is, when they were comparing India with the West, they found that India was a static society, India was a society which was not progressing, India was uncivilized. So we have large number of dichotomies or binaries which were trying to be explained. It is between Westerners as civilized society, India as primitive society, India as an Oriental society, and the Western as the Occident society, India as a caste-based society and hence a closed society, and Western as a class-based society and an open society. So the documentation or the understanding of India to a large extent during this period was in terms of these binaries or in terms of this comparison between Western and the Indian society. So if we look into the Orientalist, they were basically trying to understand Indian society through the text, through the mythology. They were not doing any research, or they were not trying to find out the system or social structure which was in this, but they were just depending on the records that was existing, and that is the Vedas and the Shastras or the religious text that was on Indian society. They studied Hindu texts, interpreted them, and they also a large number of interpretation was also based on the hearsay. That is what they heard among the people, what they heard of, and that is what they were. It's a kind of a Brahminical understanding of Indian society, because they were basically relying on two sources. One is relying on the Vedas and the Shastra, which is a Hindu religious text. trying to give a description of the Hindu society, and secondly, they were trying to converse with the Brahminical scholars, because if we go by the theory of caste system, it was only the Brahmins who had the right to get educated, and they were the only knowledgeable people. So the most of the understanding of Indian society was kind of based on the Brahminical or hegemony, or that is what they perceived of India as, and that is interpreted in the Orientalist work. They did not make any difference between prescriptive and normative. That is, what is prescribed in the text and what is actually the practice of the people. So they were going by what is written in the Vedas as fixed rule, and they were just assuming that the people were going by the rules as it is laid down. So this led to a kind of a picture of Indian society which was static, timeless, spaceless, that it is not moving in time, it was not moving in space, it was fixed, and there were certain rules laid down, and people were following those rules, and society was functioning in this manner. And as I've already said, that the major outcome of the Orientalist was the kind of a dichotomy between the Orient and the Occident. Occident is the Western society, Orient is the Eastern society or the colonial society. And this dichotomy ultimately had a negative consequence in the sense that India was seen as a society consisting of two groups which were polar opposite, that is the Hindu society and the Muslim society. And if we go back to the colonial historiography, we see that this dichotomy or this division between the Hindu and Muslim became a major part of the policy of the Britishers to divide and rule India. So this picture of India consisting of two opposed groups came in from the Orientalist. The missionaries, unlike the Orientalists, saw India as a set of religious, different from Orientalists, but similar to the Orientalists, saw India as a religious society. Again, they also went on by the Vedas and religious texts, and here they assume that it was the society or the caste system which was prescribed in the Vedas and Shastra as governing Indian society. So they said that Indian society was kind of an absurd society. It was kind of a corrupt society. And why was India a corrupt and an absurd society? Because they were basically depending on the religion as a means of regulation. So they said, the missionaries argued that it is the caste system, the legal system, the governance, and the Brahmins who control the society, which was responsible for the static condition of society or for the derogatory status of society, or Indian society. And they said that there was only one solution to come out of this derogatory status or to come out of this absurd state or corrupt state of society was through conversion. And why did they advocate conversion? Because they thought that it was Hindu religion which was responsible for the negative evils or social practices which was in the Indian society, and only when the Indians converted to Christians, the society would become a more better society. So this, as we have already said, that the way they studied Indian society was dependent on the objective, and the objective was to convert Hindus into Christians, and therefore they tried to create a picture of Indian society which was negative. Then we come to the administrative view. The administrative was largely and basically trying to observe, compiled, enumerated, categorized Indian society primarily to facilitate administration. So as the name as itself says, the administrators, all the research or the documents that were produced by the administrative perspective or traditions were basically officials who were trying to work in the British government, and this is a kind of a chronological development, but the administrative view came in much later, and it was a time when the British had taken complete charge of the administration of Indian society, and the belief was that they could efficiently administer Indian society provided they were aware of their culture, their norms, their system, and that is why they started on the task of studying Indian society. And the difference from the other two was that now they were trying to go into the society and understand. They were not only depending on religious text and early existing literature, but they were doing field work, and that is the relevance is through the census. The 1901 census, we see it was done because of an attempt to understand the Indian society. But one of the negative aspects was they considered caste as integral to the Indian society. Everything was around caste. So even the census of 1901 was based on a caste listing, and there was a lot of opposition in 1911. Then the caste listing was alphabetical. So it was kind of an detailed understanding of the land reform system, of the village economy by the administrators during the British period. In spite of the negativity, they did contribute in trying to build about a large amount of data on the Indian society. If we compare the Orientalists and missionaries, we see that they both agreed that the principle and institutions of India was the caste system, and caste system was ritual in nature, that it was dependent on the Hindu religion, prescribed by the Hindu religion, and both considered religion as responsible for the static condition of Indian society. Both accepted that Varna theory was base of Indian social structure, and caste originated in the intermarriage of the four Varna. Now, this is kind of a limitation of time, otherwise I would have gone into the details of the Varna theory. Both agreed that Hinduism as practiced was superstitious and full of abuses, and that Indians were debased and licensed. To be in a brief, the similarity is that both Orientalist and missionary brought out a negative picture of Indian society. Now, the difference between the Orientalist and missionary is that both were trying to be dependent on the kind of a book view. That is, they were only trying to study text, and they were only depending on the hearsay, but were not going into the detailed study of Indian society. Orientalists admired the depiction in Indian civilization in the script and saw present as fall from the golden age. So, one difference between the missionary and the Orientalist is that they were trying to understand that India at one point of a time was a very prosperous, very well-to-do society, and that is a depiction in the Vedas. Now, because people have not actually followed the rules very strictly, is that they have degraded. Orientalists were also better educated than the missionaries. Orientalists were basically, most of them were British scholars who had come in with the objective of doing research in India, whereas the missionaries were basically religious people who had been sent to India by British officials for the purpose of conversion. Now, we look into the contribution is that they try to develop a view of Indian society, which was a view of caste and village. Caste was in terms of the understanding of caste, as I have already said, it was seen as a thing or an entity which was out there and which could be observed. And on the basis of the observation by these scholars, most of them came out with the large number of features. So, if we go into the literature written during the colonial period, we see that most of the books or articles will have a title called Features of Caste System, and the features of the caste system which are listed are basically that caste is an endogamous group, that is, they marry within the group, that it is based on rules of commensality, that there is no interdining and intermixing between the different four castes, that is the Brahmin, Vaishya, Sudras, and that is that there is a rule that, there is a division of labor, that each caste has its own occupation to do and there is no intermixing. These are some of the features that is kind of describing the caste system as a thing out there. And India was seen as a collection of caste, and caste consisting of segregated groups and each doing their own work or division of labor. The consequence of such an official understanding of caste as a closed group was that when industrialization and when there was an impact of westernization or modernization on Indian society, most literature tried to depict a society moving from a caste-based society to a class society. And this again is a consequence of the colonial hangover over understanding of Indian society. The village in India was depicted as self-sufficient, isolated unit, and each of these units were politically and administratively isolated, and they had no interaction among the other people. Two important documents that describes the Indian village is the Fifth Report of 1812 and Charles Metcalfe Minute of Delhi Village of 1830. These have created large number of myths around village. And some of these myths are that it is basically a co-sharers of land, it is a self-sufficient economy, it is disconnected from the other village, and it is static and unchanging. Now, when we try to come into the second part of the lecture, we will see that some of these myths which has been created during the colonial people was subject to critique, and Indian sociologists like M.N. Srinivas have shown that Indian village was never a self-sufficient isolated unit, and he has shown through ethnographic research that there was always interaction and there was always it was never isolated, it was never a self-sufficient unit. What about the colonial outcome of the colonial discourse on Indian society? And that is, it was a periodical division of society between three phases, that is the colonial, the pre-colonial and the post-colonial phase. Society was seen as a social change from closed society to a open society. Three important institutions were significant for the Indian society, and that is the village, the caste and the family. All research centered around these three institutes, and there were large number of assumptions created around Indian society, like the caste system, about self-sufficiency of Indian society, which did impact the way in which sociology as a discipline was practiced in universities and in research institute. Then we come to the nationalist discourse. As the name says, the nationalist discourse is a discourse which was actually propagated by the freedom struggle, during the freedom struggle by Indian, and these scholars basically tried to oppose the colonial discourse which was given in by the colonial people, and they were trying to oppose the myth or they were negative picture that was created by the colonial in terms of reference to the historical past. And they were trying to talk about Hindu revivalism, and they was trying to argue against the colonial discourse that India was not as absurd or not as corrupt as depicted by the by the colonial scholars. There is reference to actually two kind of nationalism, that is spiritual nationalism and economic nationalism. Spiritual nationalism is in terms of reference to the large number of religion and cultural practices which brought about that the Indian society is an integrated society, it is a united society. And economy nationalism was in terms of how the Britishers had led to a drain of wealth, how the policies of Britishers has actually ruined the Indian economy, and Indian economy was something which was always prosperous and had the potential to prosper. Then if we try to understand the two characteristics of nationalist historiography is, like they were trying to bring about the glorious past of Indian society, and by doing this they were trying to bring about the positive aspect of Indian society. And then we come to the third approach, which is the subaltern approach. Now, the subaltern approach appeared in the post-independent era, and this was basically a critique of the colonial and the nationalist discourse. And they argued that both colonial and nationalist discourse was basically elitist. Elitist in the society are the upper layer of the society, and subaltern are the lower or people on the margin. So, the subaltern perspective actually says that they have the earlier historiography has neglected the role of the common people, the role of on the margin, and their role is as important as the elite. And that is what we'll see in the how they have tried to understand that it was not only the contribution of the elite that led to the freedom, but it was also the contribution of the mass which has led to the kind of an freedom. So Ranajit Guha is one of the main founder of the subaltern perspective in the Indian society, and this perspective has been applied to the study of Indian society, where now focus is on giving significance or giving attention to the Dalit, to gender, and to the other marginalized section of the society. So in this part 1 of the lecture, I have tried to very briefly try to understand how the approaches that led to the understanding of society in India, try to look into how there was contributed and how there was a limitation within each of this. And now in the second part of the lecture, I will try to delve into the development or the Indian sociological perspective and look into the contribution of some of the Indian sociologists to the discipline. Thank you. Welcome back to the second part of the lecture on Sociology of India. In this part of the lecture, I'll be talking about the Indian sociological perspective in the understanding of Indian society. So, in the very first question is, why do we need an Indian sociological perspective? And as I've already said, that it was basically a Western model that was developed and that had a repercussion on understanding of Indian society. So, we need to actually understand Indian society because we cannot blindly apply the Western theoretical perspective to understand Indian society. According to Louis Dumont, the two main reasons why we needed a sociological perspective was that Indian values are different from the Western values, mostly followed by the Indians to regulate everyday social life. There is a large amount of social cultural difference between the Indians and the Western, and therefore the society cannot be understood through the same model. The second is ethnosociology should be evolved as a methodology to study India. That is implying to say that we have to understand the life of the people as lived by them. We cannot just have a top approach and say these are the theories and this applies to Indian society. It should be actually observed and researched among the people before we arrive at certain theoretical understanding of Indian society. And as we have already seen that in the colonial period, most of the studies were done by the Western scholars. Most of them were European scholars or religious people or administrators who were contributing to the understanding of Indian society. 1960 is considered as a golden period in the sociology of India because it started trying to understand Indian rural social structure, something that was missed out till this time. Till now, most of the study was on caste, village also the social system, social structure, religion. The rural system or the rural economy was brought into focus only during the 1960s and by Indian sociologists. Some of this important perspective in the understanding of Indian sociology is that there are four perspectives basically. We have the Indological perspective, the structural functional perspective, the Marxist perspective and the Subaltern perspective. When we look into the Indological perspective, it refers to the study of Indian society from the perspective of the theories framework closely associated with Indian civilization. It is more as like the colonial discourse, where there was a understanding of Indian society through the culture, through religion, through existing religious text on Indian society. It is actually a textual study of the social structure. So it depends on what are the existing secondary sources of data like the Vedas and Shastras and other work on Indian society on which the Indological perspective is based. Two very important sociologists who have used the Indological perspective to understand Indian society are Ghurre and A.R. Desai. Now, there is a difference between Ghurre and A.R. Desai. Ghurre looked into the cultural history in India, whereas A.S. Desai tried to understand the political and economic history of Indian society. Now, these were all Indian sociologists trying to understand Indian society, applying their own sociological perspective. Now, I will go in briefly to the work that these sociologists have contributed to the discipline. G.S. Ghurre approach. G.S. Ghurre is one of the founding fathers of Indian sociologists. He was one of the initial scholars who began to understand Indian society, and unlike the other Indologists, he was using Sanskrit text to explain Indian society and culture. His approach is termed as theoretical pluralist because he tried to study Indian society and culture through multiple methods. So, you cannot not necessarily just go to understand by one method. At times, there is a need to use multiple methods to understand Indian society. And that is what he said, that Indian sociology is not static, and neither is Indian society static. It has evolved and subject to change over the period of time. Sociology in India began during the Asian period, carried on during the colonial, and developed further in the post-independent India. He does not glorify caste. So, in the first part of the lecture, I talked that the Western or the colonial discourse were trying to highlight India into a negative picture, and the nationalists were trying to glorify Indian religious past. Now, Ghurre says that it is you need not necessarily try to glorify it, but you have to understand as a structure, and therefore it have to bring out the merits as well as the demerits of the system. In his book Caste and Race in India, he agrees with Sir Risley that caste in India is like race, and both have had the origin since the Aryan period. He basically tried to understand large number of aspects in the Indian society, large caste, tribe, kinship, culture, civilization, religion, sociology of conflict, integration, family and marriage. And in the first part of the lecture, I have already said that most of the sociological literature in this period, during the period, in the initial or the beginning of the discipline of Sociology of India, was kind of around these institutions of caste, village, family, marriage, and it had not exploded as much as it could. So, most the various writing of M.S. Ghurre includes Caste and Race in India, Indian Sadhus, which was written in 1953, Bharatnatyam and its costume 1958, Family and Kinship in Indo-European culture. Now, most of the time even the understanding of these institutions was on a comparative basis, like what is the family structure in the Western society and how is the family, and one of the important measure to understand family was the whole idea of joint and the nuclear family, and we see that there was an understanding that Indian society was basically a joint family, whereas the elementary family or the unit which consists of husband, wife and their children was something which was more practiced in the Western society. And with the Western influence coming on Indian society, there was a change from joint family to nuclear family. But then sociologists like A.M. Shah has questioned such a evolutionary approach and has showed that the whole concept of jointness has to be understood in the Indian context, and there are multiple dimensions to understanding of the joint family. And then we also have the whole understanding of social tension or the social problems in India, which became a very relevant subject for understanding Indian society. And this again was the result of the changes, large scale economic, political, social changes that was happening, and basically because of the contact between Western culture and the Indian culture, there were certain assumptions which was being subject to change, that Indian cultural life was subject to change, and they were trying to become more westernized. And again, we see the contribution of M.N. Srinivas, who has done a relevant understanding of how the westernization as a concept has to be understood in the Indian context. On caste, tribe and rural urbanization, Ghore explains caste in India on the basis of again distinctive characteristic, that is segmental division of society, hierarchy, civil and religious disability and privileges, lack of unrestricted choice of occupation, because there was a division of labor, and the hierarchy, the higher the caste, they used to have occupation, and the lower the caste was, they were supposed to do the defiled work. This whole understanding of the features of caste system can be more elaborately understood in the lecture on caste system in India. Then we have a restriction on food and drinks and social intercourse, and as well as the marriage rule of endogamy, that is, in order to maintain the purity and pollution. The concept of purity and pollution was given by Louis Dumont in the understanding of Indian society. Purity was dependent on marriage and dependent on marriage so the understanding was that if the members married outside the caste, they would be polluted, and therefore to maintain purity of the caste, it was made a rule that members should marry within, and that rule was known as endogamy. Ghore considers multiple ethnic groups were present in Indian society prior to the arrival of Aryans. There was a constant interaction between Hindus and tribes, and this is in critique to theories or to understanding of tribal groups or as an isolated group, and large number of Western scholars had come out with the understanding that tribals do not interact with society, and Ghore rejected it and said that for a very long period of time both the caste and tribe had coexisted, and there was a constant interaction between the two, and yet they were able to maintain their cultural distinctiveness. He considered the cultural unity between tribe and caste as promoting integration of the Indian society, and he was more on terms of advocating the indigenous sources of urbanization. Urbanization has been considered as a Western phenomena, whereas the Ghore was trying to focus that it is the sources of this shift towards urban lifestyle or to urban economy was within the Indian social structure. Now, the second Indologist is A.R. Desai. He studied Indian society through a historical dialectical method, and a historical dialectical method is basically a method used by Karl Marx in the understanding of Indian Marxian approach to understanding society. His book on social background of Indian nationalism talks about limitations in Asian mode of production. Revisiting Marxian approach to primitive communism indicates how in pre-colonial India multiple classes were present, exploitation was inevitable, and social inequality was institutional and legitimized. In his book Rural Sociology and later also in Sociological Background of Indian Nationalism, A.R. Desai speaks about the impact of colonialism on trade, agriculture, leading to formation of new classes and intensification of exploitation. So whereas Ghurye was trying to understand the cultural aspect, that is, he was trying to understand caste, kinship, village life, A.R. Desai was trying to bring in Marxian perspective, and in Marxian perspective, the significance is given to understanding of society through the economy, and therefore he was focusing on the changes that had happened to the Indian economy due to the British colonial rule, and he was trying to understand the whole emergence of nationalism in the Indian context. Now, the second perspective to the understanding of Indian society is structural functionalism, and as the term says, structural functionalism is an important perspective in sociology which talks about the contribution of each part in the maintenance of the whole, and it had been propagated by large number of sociologists like Talcott Parson, Emile Durkheim, and in anthropology by Evans Pritchard and Radcliffe Brown. In India, the sociologists use the structural functionalism to understand the contribution of the religion, politics and economy to maintenance and the integration of Indian society. So, if we have to keep in mind two perspectives that influence the work of these Indian society. One is the existence of body of literature which was already existing, which was trying to depict India in a negative sense. So, these were the sociologists like M.N. Srinivas were trying to do away with this negative depiction, and therefore, when colonial discourse was talking about caste rigidity, Srinivas talks about caste reciprocity. So, he was using a structural functional understanding to explain the function that caste was playing in the maintenance of unity of Indian society. So, the unity becomes an integral aspect of the structural functionalist approach in sociology. They were not concerned with conflict, which is more concerned of the Marxist perspective. In the structural functionalist approach, the understanding is in terms of pattern and order. They have done extensive analysis of caste and village system in order to understand the unique nature of the Indian society. The structural functionalist view that the Indian society is made up of caste as significant parts that collectively constitutes the social system. And M.N. Srinivas is the most important sociologist who has used the structural functional approach in the understanding of society. One of his major contribution is the bringing in the book view for the study of Indian society. Now, bringing in the field view as opposed to the book view. The book view was the view that was used by the colonial discourse, that is the use of the text and the literature that is existing. So, you use secondary sources of data to understand Indian society. Srinivas said that you need to go to the field to understand Indian society, and he did intensive field work in Coorg and Rampura to understand the structure of Indian society. His focus was on understanding the village caste as important structures that function to maintain the unity and integrity of Indian society. In the field view, that is doing extensive research, he advocated the use of participant observation. Participant observation is a research method in sociology whereby the researcher spends a considerable amount of time with the respondents. In that, he spent 2 years in Coorg village which he had actually studied, and on the basis of his everyday observation and interaction with the people, he arrived at his understanding of the social system in the society. He studied in depth the religious function that he contributed to the Coorg society. He took a Durkheimian approach, that is Emile Durkheim's understanding of the elementary form of religious life, to understand how religion functions to integrate society, or how religion as such maintains the collective consciousness of the people. And he is renowned for these certain concepts, and these concepts are Sanskritization, Westernization and dominant caste. If we try to understand social change in India, he said that it has to be understood in terms of the cultural changes as well as the social changes. In understanding social change, he brings in two important concepts, and that is Sanskritization and Westernization. Sanskritization was a process by which the lower caste adopted the lifestyle of the upper caste, that is Sanskritic lifestyle, in order to move upward in the caste hierarchy. And this again is opposed to the Western understanding of caste, which said that caste is a closed system. Srinivas is highlighting that mobility or upward mobility was possible through the process of Sanskritization. And the another process was the concept of Westernization. How Westernization as a process was not only differing society to the Western understanding, but in a way was trying to strengthen the caste system. It was raising the consciousness of the people towards the rules and regulation of the caste, and therefore caste system was becoming more conscious through the process of Westernization. He also talks about Westernization in the context of the gender relation, and says that it was within the Brahminical understanding of society, roles were more flexible, whereas with Westernization, a large amount of gender norms became strict. So, in the other process was the process of dominant caste. He coined the term dominant caste in his study of Rampura village. Dominant caste were castes which was not necessarily up in the ritual hierarchy, but were higher in the secular hierarchy. That is, three criteria determined a caste was dominant in an area, and that is their numerical strength, their political will, and economic. If a caste were huge in number, they had political power, and they had economic property or a property caste, then they would become a dominant caste in the village. The second structural functionalist was S.C. Dubey. S.C. Dubey applied the structural functional approach to the study of India's changing village. Again, he was, as I have already said, that these functionalists were trying to reject the understanding of India as projected by the colonial discourse. And therefore, they were trying to say that Indian village was never autonomous, never independent, and one unit was organized or linked to the other. S.C. Dubey's understanding of Indian village brings about whole understanding of the Indian village not as a self-sufficient unit, but as an integrated. And Srinivas has given the example of weekly market, through how the bazaars in which the members of different village would integrate. Similarly, S.C. Dubey points out that no village in India is completely autonomous, and there is always an interaction between one part and the other. In his book Contemporary India and its Modernization, he discussed about bureaucracy, leadership, education, planning, secularism, to analyze the success and failures of modernization. The process of social change was an integral part of the study of most of the sociologists, because the society was assumed to be moving from a simple society to a complex society, from a rural economy to an urban economy. A large number of binaries were used to understand the evolution of society from one form to the other. Next is the Marxist perspective, and Marxist perspective provides a scientific study of society from a class angle. In the lecture on sociological perspective, the Marxian perspective would be dealt in detail. In this lecture, I am just trying to understand how Indian sociologists have used the Marxian perspective to understand Indian society. They try to understand society in terms of historical developments, and that is in dialectical materialistic term, that society is developing through one stage to the other, and it is through this change in the economic system or the modes of production that society undergoes, the social cultural aspect of society also changes. And this is the argument that was made by Karl Marx, that the economy is the base and the culture is the superstructure. So, whatever there is a change in the modes of production, it will have a repercussion on the cultural life, and therefore he said that the economic aspect was the society was in a kind of a class struggle between the haves and have-nots, or between the capitalist and the non-capitalist society. So, the importance is given to the economy of the society to understand change in Indian society. It is unlike the structural functional perspective, which gives emphasis on order or on the functions positive. Marxian perspective gives more significance on conflict, and it is the conflict between two opposing group or two unequal group, and it is through the conflict that this certain kind of order can be arrived at. So one of the Marxian perspectives to be was used by A.R. Desai. He studied macro meso-capitalism, nationalism, agrarian structure, state and peasant movement. So we see these are the areas where there are a large number of class struggle between the landowners and with the land tillers, and the state plays a very important role in trying to control the relations between the haves and have-nots. He used the Marxian notion of structure and various elements in the constitution in India, such as understanding of feudalism, capitalism, relation between class and nation, peasant and working class, post-colonial state and rights of the deprived. He has done extensive work on nationalism, peasant background, class struggle, and the rural India in transition. Another Marxian perspective was used by D.P. Mukherjee. He emphasized the need to study system as it is a distinctive feature of Indian society. Importance to study of social tradition, both past and present. So you just not understand past and neglect the present, or study present and forget past, but there is a link between the past and the present. And in the Indian society, it is very important to understand both tradition and modernity. So the tradition and modernity is not seen as polar opposite, but kind of a continuum where there is a continuous interaction between tradition and modernity, and that helps us to understand the Indian social system in a more holistic manner. He has said that in order to become a sociologist, it is very important to become an Indian first. And what he meant by saying that you need to become an Indian first is that you should be aware of your culture, of your custom, of the folklore, and therefore only can you understand the Indian society. So he was advocating sociology for India. So you need not necessarily apply the Western model to the Indian understanding of India. The next perspective is the subaltern perspective, and it is a perspective which is considered as a history from below. That is, the focus is on the marginalized or on the subordinate section of the society. The focus is on understanding class, gender, race, language and culture. A group called Subaltern Study was formed in the beginning of 1980s, and the principal aim was to collect the elitist bias which was in the historiography and to bring about a contribution of the marginalized section of the society. Ranajit Guha, Gayatri Sripak, Partha Chatterjee are some of the scholars who use this perspective to the understanding of Indian society. In his book, Ranajit Guha has argued that it was the nationalist discourse or the national understanding of nationalism was a kind of bias towards elitist, and is saying that like the colonial discourse was more bent towards a Brahminical hegemony, the nationalist discourse was trying to only portray the role of the elite in nationalist struggle, and she founded the Subaltern Studies in collaboration with other scholars. The aim was to correct historiography by trying to bring in the contribution, and therefore he makes a distinction between the elite politics and the subaltern politics, and he says that the subaltern politics is autonomous and valiant, and it is the subaltern politics or the mass or the common people whose understanding is very important to understanding of Indian society, though they have not been able to organize themselves because of the lack of a kind of leadership. The leadership always comes from the elite, and then the credit goes to the elite, and this is what Ranajit Guha is objecting to, that in order to have a historiography of Indian society, it is very important to bring about the role that the subaltern have played in Indian society. Another very important person and a renowned man in India who used the subaltern perspective was B.R. Ambedkar. In his understanding of Indian society, he wrote a book called Annihilation of Caste. And in his understanding of annihilation of caste, he critiqued the Hindu religion as a religion which was based on discriminatory practices. He actually critiqued the Shastras and the way people have used what is written in the Shastra in order to bring about inequality in society. And he said that in order to have a society which is more fair, it is necessary to do away with the caste system and do away with the Hindu religion. There is a lot of debate on what Ambedkar has argued, but what was important is that in order to understand Indian society, we have to understand from both the sides, the elite, which is the upper layer of the society, as well as the subaltern, which is the lower section of the society. And it is through the contribution of all these different sections of the society that has led to a kind of a holistic development of sociology in India. Though now there has been debate by Professor Satish Deshpande that there is a kind of fatigueness in the discipline and there is a type of stagnation, and we need to come out of the stagnation and fatigueness in order to develop a sociology for India in a true sense. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us a precious session on sociology of India. And dear friends, we believe that your feedbacks are very, very important for us. So do write to us at info.cec@nic.in. We would love to solve your queries next time Dr. Archana Prasad visits our studio. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you once again.